Donald Trump just got locked out of the most powerful military alliance in history. And it's not symbolic, it's not political theater. This is a constitutional crisis wrapped in a geopolitical nightmare, and it's happening right now. Because while you were scrolling through your feed, NATO just did something it hasn't done in 76 years. And by the time the average American realizes what this means for their bank account, their safety, and their country, the dominoes will already be falling. Now, look, the mainstream media is busy covering the latest distraction. But behind closed doors, European defense ministers are in emergency sessions, intelligence agencies are scrambling, and the US is about to lose leverage it's held since 1949. Here's what they're not telling you. This isn't just about Trump. It's not even really about politics. This is about money, trillions of dollars, defense contracts, energy deals, and a power vacuum that Russia and China have been waiting for. Let's be real for a second. If you think this won't affect you directly, you're not paying attention. So here's what just happened. NATO invoked something called the Executive Continuity Override. It's buried in a 1952 addendum that almost nobody talks about. Basically, if a sitting U.S. president is deemed unable or unwilling to fulfill treaty obligations, the alliance can temporarily bypass them and coordinate directly with Congress and the Pentagon. Trump found out about this when it was already in motion. His team tried to get him into a secure call with NATO's Secretary General, denied. They requested access to the joint defense briefing scheduled for tomorrow. Access revoked. He's not removed. He's not impeached. But functionally, he's been cut out of the loop on the biggest military decisions on the planet. And it gets darker. The trigger for this wasn't a single event. It was a pattern. Over the last 3 weeks, Trump has made 6 separate statements questioning America's commitment to Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause that's basically NATO's entire foundation. He floated the idea of a separate security deal with Hungary and Turkey outside of NATO's framework. He reportedly told advisors he wanted to pull U.S. troops from Germany and reallocate them to, quote, more appreciative allies. Now, you can debate whether those ideas have merit, but here's what you can't debate. NATO's command structure saw those statements as a direct threat to collective security, and they have a protocol for this. It's never been used until now. Behind the scenes, this started on January 28th, a classified meeting in Brussels, attended by defense ministers from the UK, France, Germany, and Poland. No Americans in the room. The meeting lasted 4 hours, and by the end of it, they'd agreed on something unprecedented. They would activate the override and establish a temporary command structure that reports to the North Atlantic Council, not the White House. The legal justification, a clause that allows NATO to ensure operational continuity if the Supreme Allied Commander, who's always an American general, receives conflicting orders from political leadership. It's a loophole, but it's a real one. And here's where it gets complicated. Because this isn't just Europe going rogue. The Pentagon is quietly cooperating. Not officially, not publicly. But senior military officials have been in contact with NATO command for weeks, reassuring them that U.S. forces will continue to honor treaty commitments regardless of political turbulence. In other words, the military is hedging against its own commander-in-chief. That's not a coup. It's not treason. But it's a fracture in the chain of command that hasn't existed since the Civil War, and the implications are staggering. Remember when Trump said NATO countries need to pay their fair share? Well, they just called his bluff. Hard. Germany just announced a $120 billion emergency defense package. Poland is moving troops to its eastern border. France is quietly reactivating old missile sites. But here's the kicker. They're doing it without waiting for U.S. approval. Believe it or not, this is the first time since World War II that Europe is militarizing independently of Washington. And they're not asking permission. They're not waiting for coordination. They're moving. Why? because they think the US is no longer a reliable partner. And whether you agree with that or not, the market believes it. Defense stocks tied to European contracts, soaring, Rheinmetall, BAE Systems, Thales, all up double digits in the last week. US dollar confidence index quietly sliding, and oil futures starting to swing wildly because everyone knows what comes next. When military alliances fracture, energy security fractures with them. Europe gets 40% of its natural gas from pipelines that cross contested territories. If NATO's security guarantees become uncertain, those pipelines become targets, and oil prices become weapons. But let's zoom out for a second, because the financial disruption is just the surface. The real story is what this means for global power distribution. For 76 years, NATO has been the backbone of what political scientists call the liberal international order. It's not just a military alliance, it's the security architecture that underpins global trade, financial systems, and diplomatic norms. When that architecture cracks, everything built on top of it starts to shift, and we're seeing the first tremors right now. Take the US dollar. It's the world's reserve currency, not because of economic fundamentals alone, but because of security guarantees. Countries hold dollars because they trust that the US will protect global shipping lanes, enforce contracts, and maintain stability. But if the US can't even maintain unity within its own alliances, that trust erodes. We're not talking about the dollar collapsing overnight, but we are talking about central banks quietly diversifying. China's yuan, the euro. Even gold reserves are being accumulated at rates we haven't seen since the 1970s. This isn't paranoia. This is risk management at the sovereign level, and Wall Street sees it. Goldman Sachs just issued a private memo to top clients warning of unprecedented instability in transatlantic defense posture. JP Morgan has advised institutional investors to increase allocations to defensive assets. Morgan Stanley's geopolitical risk team told clients to prepare for a scenario where European and American strategic interests diverge for the first time in modern history. Translation: the smart money is hedging against a scenario where NATO doesn't function the way it has for 8 decades. That's not speculation. That's the financial elite preparing for a world where the rules have changed. But that's not even the craziest part. While NATO is fracturing, there's a country that's been very quiet this week: Russia. No statements, no propaganda, no threats, just silence. And in geopolitics, silence is never a good sign. US intelligence intercepts from the last 48 hours show unusual military communications in Kaliningrad and along the Ukrainian border. Not mobilization, not aggression, just repositioning. It's like watching someone set up chess pieces while everyone else is arguing about the rules. Satellite imagery analyzed by independent defense analysts shows Russian forces conducting what they're calling routine exercises. But the formations are anything but routine. They're practicing rapid deployment scenarios, testing supply lines, hardening communication networks. This is the kind of activity you see when a military is preparing for options, not for show. And the timing, suspiciously aligned with NATO's internal chaos. Russia doesn't need to invade anyone right now. They just need to wait, because every day that NATO remains fractured is a day that Russia's strategic position improves without firing a single shot. And then there's China. Beijing has been eerily silent on this too, but their actions speak volumes. In the last 10 days, Chinese military aircraft have increased incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone by 40%. Chinese naval vessels have been conducting freedom of navigation operations, their term for it, in waters near the Philippines and Japan. And Chinese diplomats have been making quiet overtures to countries in Eastern Europe, offering infrastructure deals and investment packages that come with very specific strings attached. They're not being aggressive, They're being opportunistic, and that's more dangerous. Because here's what China understands. NATO's fracture isn't just a military problem, it's a credibility problem. If the US can't maintain alliance coherence with its closest partners, why would Taiwan believe American security guarantees? Why would Japan? Why would South Korea? The entire US alliance system in the Indo-Pacific is built on the assumption that America keeps its promises. But if NATO implodes, that assumption dies. And China has been waiting for this moment for 30 years. Let's talk about the economic blast radius. Because this isn't just about defense budgets and military positioning. The transatlantic economy is worth over $5 trillion annually. It's the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, and it depends on political and security alignment. If that alignment breaks, trade deals get renegotiated, supply chains get reorganized, tariffs get weaponized. We're already seeing the first signs. European officials are quietly discussing contingency plans for a scenario where US trade policy becomes hostile or unpredictable. They're talking about accelerating trade agreements with China, with India, with Southeast Asia, not because they want to, but because they can't afford to be dependent on a partner they don't trust. And it's not just Europe. US allies in Asia are watching this very carefully. Japan has already started increasing defense spending at the fastest rate since World War II. South Korea is exploring independent nuclear deterrence options for the first time in decades. Australia is fast-tracking submarine acquisitions and military modernization programs. These are countries that have relied on US security guarantees for generations, and they're preparing for a world where those guarantees might not be enough. That's a seismic shift, and it's happening in real time. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Is this Trump's fault? That's the question everyone's asking. And honestly, it's the wrong question, because this fracture has been building for years. Obama faced criticism from NATO allies for being too cautious. Biden struggled to rebuild trust after Afghanistan. The transatlantic relationship has been strained for a long time. Trump didn't create these fault lines, but his rhetoric, his policies, his unpredictability, they're accelerating a process that was already underway. He's the spark, not the fuel. But in a room full of gasoline, the spark is what matters. And here's what makes this so dangerous. There's no obvious off-ramp. NATO can't just undo the override without losing credibility. Trump can't back down without looking weak. European leaders can't reverse their defense buildups without political suicide. Everyone is locked into positions that are increasingly incompatible. And in international relations, when positions become incompatible, you get either negotiation or conflict. Right now, nobody's negotiating. So what happens next? Well, there are 3 scenarios playing out in war games and policy simulations right now. Scenario 1, the managed fracture. NATO continues to function but in a fundamentally different way. The US remains a member but loses its leadership role. Europe builds independent military capacity. The alliance becomes more of a loose coalition than a unified command structure. This is the optimistic scenario. It's messy, it's expensive, but it avoids catastrophe. Scenario 2, the collapse. NATO falls apart completely. Article 5 becomes meaningless. European security fragments into regional pacts. The US withdraws into hemispheric defense. Russia fills the vacuum in Eastern Europe. China accelerates its timeline in Asia. Global trade contracts. Markets panic. This is the nightmare scenario. And while it sounds extreme, it's not impossible. Alliances have collapsed before. The League of Nations, the Baghdad Pact, CEDAW. History is littered with security arrangements that seemed permanent until they weren't. Scenario 3, the reconstitution. A major crisis, a Russian provocation, a Chinese move on Taiwan. something that forces NATO to reunify under existential threat. This is the scenario that defense planners are quietly hoping for, which is insane when you think about it. They're hoping for a crisis because it's the only thing that might restore unity. But crises are unpredictable. And betting on a controlled crisis is like betting on a controlled explosion. The risks are enormous. And here's what nobody's talking about: the nuclear dimension. NATO's nuclear sharing agreements depend on trust and coordination. The US has tactical nuclear weapons stationed in 5 European countries: Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Those weapons are under dual key control, meaning both the US and the host country have to agree to use them. But if NATO's command structure is fractured, if trust breaks down, what happens to those weapons? Do they get withdrawn? Do they stay under ambiguous control? Do host countries start questioning whether they should develop their own independent deterrents? These are questions that haven't been seriously asked since the Cold War, and now they're back on the table. Let's be real for a second. Most people don't think about nuclear weapons on a daily basis. But the people who manage global security think about them constantly. And right now, they're worried. Not about intentional use, but about accidents, about miscalculations, about a scenario where fractured communication leads to a situation spiraling out of control faster than diplomacy can catch up. That's the real nightmare. Not war by design, but war by mistake. So what do you do with this information? First, understand that this isn't over. This is day one of a process that could reshape global power for the next 50 years. Second, pay attention to what's not being said. Official statements from NATO and the White House will be carefully calibrated to minimize panic. But the real story is in the actions, troop movements, budget allocations, diplomatic cables. Third, watch the markets. Money moves faster than politics. If you see sustained capital flight from transatlantic assets, if you see a spike in volatility around defense stocks or energy futures, that's the market pricing in outcomes that politicians aren't ready to admit yet. If you want to track how this unfolds, and more importantly, what it means for your investments, your security, and your future, just keep a close eye on February 15th. That's when NATO's emergency summit happens. And whatever comes out of that room will decide whether this alliance survives or whether we're watching the end of the world order as we know it.